Hello, Second Harvest Food Bank, and welcome to the beginning of the Healthy Food, Healthy Life initiative. I'm Dr. Eric Krall. Before we really dive into the first pillar, just a few general remarks to help you understand how we've actually come to this point where lifestyle medicine has emerged to help us truly get at the root causes of all the things that ail us. And it really started once we understood what causes healthy aging and how that differs from unhealthy aging. So for that, we really just looked at centenarians and developed a clear understanding of what differs in people who live to 100 compared to the rest of us. And what clearly emerged was that people who live to 100 seem to have ideal metabolic health right up until their 70s or 80s, until the actual natural aging process takes over and they actually develop poor metabolic health, and it takes about 20 years for that sequence of events to lead to death from natural causes. So in the rest of us who experience poor metabolic health earlier in life, it essentially initiates the same cascade of events that slowly shut down our organs and lead to death over roughly a 20-year time frame. Of course, it might be 10 or 30 depending on genes, but the point is the average life expectancy might be 78, but for any individual, once you have poor metabolic health, the process that leads to death from all of its effects on your organs takes an average of 20 years. So that leads us to an appreciation for lifestyle medicine, because all of these diseases that accelerate aging and cause poor metabolic health are diseases of lifestyle. So a quick word about what poor metabolic health actually means. It is caused by chronically elevated insulin, inflammation, and cortisol. You see, each of these three things are essential for our survival, but they're not supposed to be turned on all the time. Insulin is only supposed to be turned on when we eat so that we can process those nutrients, store a little fat for later, and then it goes down again. When insulin is high all the time, you are basically chronically storing fat for a famine that's never going to come. And likewise, inflammation is supposed to be high when we're fighting an infection to deliver our immune system where it needs to go. But when inflammation is turned on all the time, it actually damages our blood vessels. Finally, cortisol, clearly important for survival if we happen to be fleeing a tiger. It pumps glucose into our bloodstream so we have plenty of fuel to our muscles, increases our heart rate, our blood pressure. But when that's turned on all the time, the effects are devastating actually in terms of metabolic health and cardiovascular health. Of note also, the first two pillars generally reduce inflammation and insulin, whereas the last two pillars, as we'll get to later, are going to be essential for reducing cortisol. And so here we go on to the first pillar, which is nutrition. And my goal here is really to kind of help simplify this, to make sense of all the fluff that's out there, because it really does get kind of confusing, doesn't it? What are you supposed to eat? Are you supposed to follow low carb? Are you supposed to follow low fat? And really, a part of the confusion is because everybody's just talking about macros. No one's talking about food. What should you eat? They're just talking about whether it should be high carb or low carb or high fat. So that creates a lot of confusion. So whenever there's confusion like that, it's a lot more simple that our emphasis needs to be, let's focus on the foods that everyone agrees are healthy foods. And then let's look at the foods that almost everyone agrees are not healthy and talk about nutrition that way. That's a much simpler view. So that makes for a very useful framework in which we lump foods into green box, yellow box, and red box foods. And as you can see here, the foods that no one debates are healthy are the grains, the beans, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and the foods that are universally recognized to be harmful are the processed meats, added sugars and all of the refined grains, the whites, and the ultra processed things. And then red meat, if consumed in excess, would also be generally recognized as unhealthful. We throw the poultry, eggs, dairy, fish into a yellow box simply because they are potentially harmful when consumed to excess, but in moderation, very, very unlikely to be harmful. So with that as a context then, you can see that nutrition should be viewed as a continuum between two extremes, where on the one end, the standard American diet is obviously undisputably unhealthy and the root of disease, and on the other end, you have a 100% predominantly whole food plant-based eating pattern, which is undeniably healthy. So the best nutrition for any one person to follow is somewhere in the middle, but as close as you can get to the whole food plant-based eating pattern. So your challenge then is to do the best you can on a consistent basis to increase the amount of whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds, vegetables, and fruits, and to do the best you can to consistently restrict or even eliminate the ultra-processed foods, processed meats, added sugars, and all the refined carbohydrates, which we'll get into in more detail. And this focuses on what you should eat. How much you should eat and when you should eat is something that'll be addressed more so with your primary care doctor. And I think it's also quite helpful to understand what it is about processed foods that makes them so unhealthy. This is a very, very important point in nutrition, because real whole foods exist as they exist in nature. They have not been processed by human hands. They are very nutrient dense. They have a lot of fiber, a lot of nutrients, as they do naturally. And they tend to make us full quicker because of their fiber content. And they are also significantly pre-digested by our gut bacteria. So literally the blood sugar in our bloodstream goes up much more slowly because they've been pre-digested to some extent. On the contrary, processed foods have all of their fiber stripped out of them. That's what it means to be refined. A refined grain has the actual germ and fiber content removed from it. And then they're generally enriched with vitamins, minerals, sugar, and salt. So processed foods lack nutrient density. They do not fill you up. So then you eat more food. So the processing leads to the overconsumption. The blood sugar, the glucose and the salt and all those are harmful enough, but the primary feature of them is that they do not make you full, so you eat more. And that is an intentional thing that the food industry does, so you'll buy more food. The other thing about processed foods is they're generally what we call hyperpalatable. They taste great and they stimulate taste buds that generally don't get stimulated. So now all of a sudden your hunger is supposed to be based mainly on whether you feel full or not. And now our hunger is determined by whether or not we've had adequate satiation of our desire for sweet and salt. And that's obvious to anyone who's experienced that sensation at the end of a meal where you are just full, but there's always a little bit of space for dessert. So normally you would stop eating because you are full, but you have this other desire for these hyperpalatable taste sensations that the food industry has created for us. So it can't be overemphasized that when we're talking about real whole foods, especially in carbohydrate category, we're talking about foods that are high in fiber, high in antioxidants, minerals, and vitamins as they exist in nature. So it's whole grains, which are brown rice, oats, and quinoa, and whole corn. And pasta is fine when it's made from whole wheat, brown rice, quinoa, or beans. And of course, vegetables, fruits, beans, nuts, and seeds. And a word about the starchy vegetables, potatoes and sweet potatoes. They are actually real whole foods and are certainly fine. But it is true that some of the more obese, more insulin resistant individuals have to get some weight off and get a little bit more metabolically healthy before they consume the pasta and potatoes. And the refined carbohydrates, or the bad carbs, if you will, are the white rice, the white flour pasta, white bread. And in that category, I would also include any bread that is made with enriched flour. It may say wheat and it may look healthy, but if it's enriched wheat flour, it's no better than white bread. And of course, it goes without saying, the sodas, the candies, the cereals with all the added sugars, and all the desserts. These are the processed foods that will leave you wanting more and relentlessly searching for similar foods. So in the unhealthful red box category, we add processed meats mainly because they're pretty highly associated with cancer, not just poor metabolic health. So any meats that have been modified by curing, smoking, salting, so basically bacon, hot dogs, bologna, sausage, salami, pepperoni, ham, deli meats, and of course the staple of many children's diets, the old chicken nuggets. But a word about red meat. There is not nearly as unanimous consensus that they belong here. It's possible that red meat or diets high in red meat are harmful not because of the red meat, but because there's relatively less of the healthy foods in the green box. But in general, it's felt that minimizing red meat is probably a judicious thing to do, and what matters more is probably where the red meat comes from. So industrial raised beef may be more harmful than beef from grass-fed, sustainably raised sources. So that's where I would really leave the red meat category. Moderation, and it's not the cow, but the how and where the meat was processed from. So I've skipped over the added sugar and the refined grains because we already covered those, but you can never emphasize enough the ultra-processed foods in the red box unhealthy category, because those have been chemically modified and they generally have a list of ingredients of 10 or 20 more, most of which you really can't pronounce. So their key feature is the fact that they just overstimulate all of our taste buds and do not fill us at all, leaving us just wanting more and leading to overconsumption. And they really are the main root of chronically elevated insulin and inflammation that drives disease and literally makes us feeling bad even in the moment. So you can't really make a commitment to improving your health over the long term without making a focused effort on restricting or eliminating these. So a few closing thoughts as we wrap up this first pillar. I did want to make a comment about protein, because I've made the point clear that our focus is not macros, but protein is still important, because protein is not just a macronutrient. It's actually important for strength and the maintaining lean muscle mass. So protein does matter. Not that you would need to count it or track it, but in general, women, for the most part, need like 80 grams of protein a day, and men more like 120 to sometimes 150 grams. So you just need to make sure that you are including foods in the green and yellow box that are high in protein, like beans. Some of the grains have protein. The foods such as the eggs and cheeses in moderation, the leaner meats, just to make sure you're getting adequate protein, and for the benefit that provides in also helping you feel full. And you do generally eat less when there is an adequate protein content of the foods you eat. So good luck as you embark on this journey. Remember that with any change, you're always going to be faced with with some of those old habits wanting to creep back in. So remember, your success with this is a long-term marathon, not a sprint, is going to really be dependent on how solid your why is. Like, why are you making this change? Why is it worth making any change? And hopefully you have to decide what that why is. No one can give you your why, but hopefully it's really just with a vision of your long-term health, like that vision of your 80-year-old self. Like, what do you want your 80-year-old self to be able to do? To be functional, to be moving, lifting, traveling. Do you want your 80-year-old self to have your full cognitive capabilities? So you have to reverse engineer that vision of what you want for your life when you finally reach that retirement that you plan for. So as long as your why is solid, then when the negative thoughts start creeping in, why is this so hard? Why doesn't everyone else live this way? Why is it so expensive? And why am I a failure? Why can't I commit to things long term? When those thoughts keep creeping in, as long as that long-term vision of why you're doing this is solid, you are much more likely to be successful. So that's it for pillar number 1. Within the week or so, I'll be sending you another video to give you some insights on activity. So I hope you'll be looking forward to advancing to the next step. And remember, if you haven't set up an appointment with your primary care physician to have your initial baseline assessment and all that done, and begin to make a very specific plan based on some of these insights with your primary care doctor, you should do that now. So, thank you again, as always, for your attention.